I can't imagine. I never look at Goodreads, but I feel like that must be the place people are like, I'm really offended by your politics. Don't pick up this book. It's about murdering babies.
Yeah. I think it's hard not to go. I don't have the right personality to not look at those things. Like I always need to like scratch the itch if they exist. I'm going to go look at them. But I think it's like a friend of mine nicely like predict. She was just like, oh, people won't like this, this, and this about your novel. And that's correct. And I was like, oh, great. And I was like, that's all reasonable. Those are things people could not like. And then it was fine. But I do think it's like it's a very fraught site in the industry, especially because you don't have to read, even though it's owned by Amazon, they don't do the verified purchase. So you can sync a book you haven't read.
Oh.
Which is controversial, I guess, it's hard because I've been talking about books I haven't read my whole career. Yeah. So what am I going to deny other people that pleasure? But I think it means like people can swarm a book and try to sync it, but I don't know.
Do you remember when there was that book that was like how to talk about books you haven't read?
Yeah.
I remember, I didn't read it, which seems like the only way for me to talk about it. But I do remember seeing that like remaindered like heavily in Labyrinth books on the Upper West Side.
That's how I dealt with the Marinetti distant reading book, which was such hot shit when I was just as my PhD was beginning to get stale. And I'm like, no, I'm going to let it stay in the distance. And then he got canceled.
Patrick, this is so satisfying because I just recycled that book.
Yeah, he's scum.
I had left someone, I think I'd loaned it to someone and they gave it back and were like, didn't really want to read this. And then I was like, we can just recycle this. We don't have to have this book anymore. Like
that's very liberating.
Maps and trees doesn't matter. Anyway, it felt maps, I don't forget what order it's in.
Whatever. Close reading is back. We're done with distant reading.
There is part of the thing that I find interesting about Goodreads, and
do you use Goodreads?
Not that often, no. I mean, what does it mean to use this thing? Like, I'll look at Rotten Tomatoes too. I don't really.
You don't have a secret Goodreads account that I don't know about, where like you go and talk about like how much you love Sarah J. Maas.
No, I only use YA forums for that posting. But the thing about Goodreads in general, but also particularly with your novel in mind, and I'm not talking about like the reads per se on Goodreads.
Just the good.
Yeah, just the good of the book. But also like one thing your novel does is I kept on tracking this theme of like knowledge and first person experience and traumatic knowledge and sort of the knowledge of what a process is supposed to mean. And again, this extremely subtle and provocative and intricate grammar and thematization of the question of what we can know and the limits of how we know it and how knowledge may or may not even translate into or be relevant to an ethical calculus. But the thing on Goodreads is that it seems like people don't have, how do I say this delicately? Like theory of mind seems to be a problem there, where a lot of it's like, I thought I knew this character, but then they did something that surprised me and now I feel betrayed. Or I loved this book and it's exactly the book I would have written, except for when this happened. Or, and I don't even mean just like the total befuddlement of people not being able to parse plots or not allowing a text to sort of speak on its own terms or deal with anything complicated formally, or people being unable to distinguish between like a unreliable narrator or an omniscient sort of third person or any of that. Or even just the kind of continually recurrent like Victorian morality play expectations that people seem to have, that things be very didactic, but just that people seem to want to know what they're about to get.
Yeah.
And then to have that knowledge reaffirmed back to them in a way that I don't really know if knowledge is even the word there. Like there's no gradient of ambiguity in it.
That's cool. I was just, when you're saying that, it's like, on Goodreads, people are all, it's like they're characters and the author is a character. And the book, like we're all in a fan fiction or something, because I sort of like admire on Goodreads when people are like, sometimes they're just like, I respected this novel, but I didn't like it, or it's not for me, like that sort of like very straightforward kind of fair thing where you're just like, a person with desires that I don't need to account for, I'm just like, I didn't like it. Didn't like the ending. No. Like, and you're like, yeah, that all makes sense. But then it's like not doing the thing that you're talking about, which is trying to like think about the novel as an act of writing or thinking, or like what kinds of questions it's trying to ask, or what is, what it wants us to engage with or talk about together in any way of like the emotional, social, political, et cetera. Like it's instead we're all like matchmaking or something, like being like, is this the novel I wanted? Is this the novel I wanted? No, like, I'm just like looking for my match. Like, yeah.
My fated mate. I'm like, I do feel like Goodreads has been so devoured by romantasy that it is the match. You're like, nope.
Yeah.
Not right. Not reflecting back the thing that I am already putting forth into the world.
I have to think about too, the correlative we're thinking about in terms of like romances and pairings is the kind of online discourse about breakups and like discovering that someone is secretly a narcissist. And again, we bracketing a more complicated conversation about narcissism, like people being like, wow, I thought I knew this person, but then for whatever entirely normal set of reasons, the thing fizzles. And then it's not just two people didn't work out, or we weren't going to work out, or we were different places at different times. It becomes like a revelation that this person was a different person the entire time. And because how could anybody not love me as much as I yearn to be loved, right? And the feeling of betrayal and anger and a type of doubling down on the self, and how that is opposed again to a more complicated set of feelings. And the feeling that I also found the book thematizing, and if you forgive me reading something back to you that you yourself wrote, the feeling of regret. And this is the voice of your narrator speaking, I think, to a journalist. I'd say regret is a feeling. Abortion is something that happened. Regret is a relationship you have with yourself. You can't bring other people into it or ask them to have known something about you that even you didn't know. At which point it seems totally fair to be like, I regret buying this book, or I regret reading it, but
yeah,
this book duped me, or like this book was, yeah. I mean,
I guess to me, I feel like this is a very stupid thought, but to the point, I feel like all my books are about problems of knowing. Like that's what they're about to me, and is what like relates them. So I'm sort of like moved that that's where you started, kind of in engaging with this book, because I do feel like abortion is this incredible example of how people know their own lives, and make decisions in relation in totally based on their own analysis, right? Like what are your values? What factors are you weighing in this decision? And that is exactly what the decision answers to. That's it, right? Like it's your own knowing. And then it's this like, but at these like points, these like really crucial points of where your life intersects other people's, and where it's like most intimately connected to other people's, including people who don't exist yet, like, so I wrote a little bit about this in my book, Whole Studies. Did you guys encounter this book, The Turnaway Study? This kind of like big sociological study on abortion that came out a few years ago.
No, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, it's sort of like what was so like beautiful and satisfying about it is it just like, I felt, at least my experience of it as a reader was just like, oh, this study, which was like very thorough, really just confirmed that people are correct about what abortion can do for them. Like when they want to get an abortion, they say it's for XYZ reasons. And they have a strong analysis that XYZ reasons are things that abortion can really have an effect on, right? Like it's about their, whether they want to be in a relationship, their care for their other children, like their job situation, like their education situation, like the money that, like, and so when it like tracks 1,000 women who got abortions, I think I forget now over how many years, I want to say 5 years, but
it's a pretty long time. I do remember this study.
Yeah, it's a long time, and like many interviews, and just like is like such a thick, it has these beautiful long monologues in it that are like, sort of cumulative. They're constructed from a number of different interviews. But like the feeling at the end, at least for me as a reader, now I sound like I'm like have entered the mode of a good reader, like became one or something. Was just this incredibly satisfying thing where people like were right. They were like, oh, like, I don't think I should have this kid because it would keep me in a relationship with this guy, and like all of the analysis is like really right about, or really confirms their sense of what abortion can do.
Yeah.
Like what is it good for? What effects can it have? So it's like such an affirming, moving, like like testimony about like that people are good at thinking their own lives. That's it. Like they can do it. And in fact, abortion is this way that they like do it successfully because people tend to achieve their goals through abortion. But like that's, I wrote that whenever it would have been like a little before Dobbs or something. And you're like, oh, of course, that's yet another reason why they really don't want us to have it. Like,
Right.
because it's such a self-contained, effective, powerful mode of decision making that people who are mostly women have, where they like exert quite a lot of agency in the sort of complicated, constrained context of their own lives. And where they make a decision like completely on their own terms about like, I was going to finish school this year. I'm up for a promotion. Like I wanted to move, but I couldn't move because I need to be near my parents if I have another kid, blah, blah, blah. Like all of those things, they just decide on their own terms. So you're like, oh, that's why they don't want us to have it because it's our thinking. It's our like way of saying what what we know about our lives and what we want and what we're good at.
The thing about that, I do remember reading, I didn't read the study, but I remember when it came out, like reading, I don't know, the Times article or whatever it is. And, one of the words that Patrick started out with reading that passage from your book is regret, right? And so much of what that study demonstrates is the absence of regret. And which has been such a powerful right-wing narrative of like, we can't let people make this decision because what if the world in which they regret, right? And this is like an actual empirical demonstration of the way in which that rhetoric is just like absolutely, wrong, inaccurate. Like I was grasping for like a fancier word, but the word is like wrong.
Yeah.
And, there's something, it's really, I hadn't thought about that study while I was reading the book, but now I don't think there's any spoilers. Like there's something that's really moving to me about like, you have not written a like likable female protagonist, right? Like, although I did love her very much. But she's not she's spiky. She's prickly. And not in just like a quiet sort of way from Go, which is also hilarious in a receptionist.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's an incredible trait in a receptionist. Speaking of somebody who's been a receptionist in several in several contexts and been reprimanded for being a little too blunt. She isn't nice. And she also is having a lot of epistemological problems.
Yeah.
But the one thing that the fixed point is abortion is a positive good.
Yeah. I think it's like that. I just looked at the little page I pulled up, which said like the turning rate study, affirmed like 95% of the women that they interacted with, felt it was the right choice the whole time. And you're like, that's such a low rate of regret. Like I regret most things for like at a higher rate than that. It's just like that's a positive relationship with the choice, with the decision. Particularly given that most of our decisions aren't really particular. You know what I mean? Like it's like a strain to call them decisions a lot of the time. Like you sort of like maybe got to choose or use, it's like much more muddled. I think for that narrator, I guess how I think about it, because she's like a difficult person, and as a character, she's sort of like a narrow aperture. Like she doesn't perceive terribly much about other people. And I was really excited to write like that. And I was, maybe for reasons of my own, excited to write a narrator who didn't know everything that I knew, but hopefully knew some different things that I could learn about by writing her. Like I was really, when I started, I was like, I want to write someone who's like a bad employee. And since the book came out, I've been like, I really was trying to learn more about being a bad employee. Like, it's just, I wanted to know more about it because I was really reaching a point in my life where I felt embarrassed that I'd been such a fucking good employee the whole time. You know what I mean? I was like, what is your problem? Like, and I still have it. Like, I still wish I were worse. Like, but I feel like that, so I wanted to learn more about what she knows. And I wanted to be in some types of thoughts that I hadn't respected as much, like maybe challenge some hierarchies in my own thinking. And at some point when I was revising, I was like, okay, take out everything that a runner or a stoner wouldn't think. Like, um, and so, which I feel like I'm am also a runner and a student. So I was like, okay. Like, what do you know when you're in and I felt like maybe because just in relation to abortion as a subject that character may be good at thinking about. It's, I think, because she doesn't feel like she knows other people terribly well. And I think she doesn't feel like they know her terribly well. So that sense of privacy of like that people have their reasons and you don't know what the fuck they are. Like, it's not your business, like that is a good attitude around something like abortion, where you're just like, you need to give an account. Like, I don't know, I probably wouldn't understand anyway, is at least how probably she thinks, like, or she doesn't care, but that means it's leaving people quite a lot of space to be themselves and to not have to give an account of themselves or like justify or explain or like be like, we're creating a shared value system. Like, she's not, that character isn't interested in that. So I think that's why I was somehow wanting to create that mindset and put it in conversation with the type of private but democratic thinking that abortion is.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so happy to welcome Hilary Plum to the show. Hilary is a writer, editor, and teacher whose most recent works include the novel State Champ, just out from Bloomsbury in May 2025, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Her other works include the essay collection Whole Studies and the long poem Important Groups. She edits the Open Prose series at Rescue Press with Zach Savage. She co-hosts the podcast Index for Continuance with Zach Peckham. Hilary teaches at Cleveland State and serves as Associate Director of the CSU Poetry Center. Hilary, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, it's so nice to be here. Thank you, guys. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
The book is amazing. State Champ. We've known you for a long time, like full disclosure. I think actually it was another guest of the podcast, Sarah Marcus, who was on here to talk about her book, Political Disappointment, who was part of introducing us to you these many years ago in Philly. And so we've been reading your work for a long time. State Champ it's a beautiful book. I mean, it's a painful book. So I feel like beautiful is not like the right word. Let's say it is like a gorgeous and harrowing book. It is about, among many other things, abortion. It's about running. I guess I didn't have in my list being a stoner, but it is about that. Politics, eating disorders, hunger strikes. And it's all told through the journal of the character of Angela, this bad employee that you alluded to before, a receptionist in an abortion clinic that has been shuttered. Hilary, can you tell our listeners a little bit about the book and also about how you came to this project?
Yeah, I started writing this book in the summer of 2020, so during our like shutdown time, and it's about like a Midwestern state that's kind of, it's kind of like Ohio, the city in the novel almost resembles Cleveland, but I left it open, which I tend to do in my fiction just to keep things a little bit more in a space of like fable or not pinned down, because I feel like that activates some It leaves things more open and active. But anyway, it was before, Roe v. Wade fell, before the Dobbs decision. So it was like a little bit more speculative. It was about like, okay, what if a heartbeat bill passed?
Right.
And so I, was working on it for about 2 years before all of that happened. And then briefly in Ohio, abortion was quite restricted. And then eventually, with thanks to all the people who made this happen, we had a big statewide referendum. And it's now, knock on wood, back enshrined in law. And they put it on the ballot. Well, I don't know, this is a strategy, but it was on the ballot the same moment as the legalization of weed, which I think was effective in both directions.
Hell yeah.
Both of which they're trying to walk back now. But anyway, I think for me, the maybe the heart of the novel, or starting it, was about a lot of my work is about protest, maybe like art as protest, or protest as art, or like why people try to create some sort of disruption or rupture, even if it's just in their own life or their own like thinking or activities. And so it's about this receptionist, this bad employee who goes on a hunger strike fairly impulsively to try to protest the end of abortion in her state and the imprisonment of the doctor in the clinic where she'd worked, who's referred to as Dr. M. So she's ostensibly, she's like, I'm trying to, free Dr. M, but it's not terribly like strategic. So that's a space I like to be in, of like the maybe ineffectual protest, and which is maybe also because I have like a natural irritation at this idea that protests have to like be effective, or like, and maybe this is all lingering after the discourse around Occupy or something, where people were always like, Occupy didn't have like a mission or a goal. And I was like, is that important? Like, I don't know. So maybe I was a little bit in that set of thoughts. So that's kind of where the novel gathered, is around those ideas and kind of this, these questions of bodily autonomy and freedom that we just talked about a little bit in relation to abortion as this kind of like thinking about where your body meets your life, meets society, meets your, how you think about your life and what you want from it, how you think about your relationships to other people. And also the hunger strike in relation to that, because it's this, very, very desperate form of speech that people use when their other speech is no longer heard, or hasn't been recognized or received. So I wanted to think about those things together, and that kind of like autonomy, like a hunger strike is this sort of a last ditch attempt to assert your autonomy over yourself, and to communicate that way. So yeah, that's kind of where it evolved. And I had a lot of jokes that I wanted to put somewhere that were a certain kind of a joke.
Yeah.
And Zach, my husband, was like, to put all, like put those all in one place, like in a novel. And so that's what, like where I was like, okay, I think I can get, I don't know, this voice or something. And to you guys, I'll say, like, for some reason, because of the kind of jokes they were, he was referring to them as Quip Cheney. I don't remember why, but that was what we called that set of jokes. So anyway, that's why like
Nice.
She has a certain way of talking that I was like working through maybe in my own life as Quip Cheney.
Amazing. I hope that we can explore more this idea of not necessarily ineffectual protest, but protest that is not purely teleological in like one, clear sort of like, I am doing X to achieve Y, which is interesting also because actually going to an abortion clinic is very much about doing X to achieve Y. And I hear you also, and I remember all of this rhetoric around Occupy as well. And, there is something also about like that kind of discourse forgets about like the function of protest as consciousness raising for the people who are involved in it, right? Which is not like a neatly teleological kind of process. You can't be like, today you're going to get your consciousness raised and it's going to happen in the following ways, right? There's like a sort of, this isn't a word, but I'm going to make it a word, like an unpredestinableness to it. Anyway, this is a long way of getting to one of the things I really want to ask you about, and I have notes about this like all over my copy, One of the things that I so admired about this book, and it's really, I think, Hilary, I think this is a hallmark of your writing, because you have never shied away from tackling unbelievably controversial political issues, right? So, like, it is a deeply, unabashedly political book. And I don't mean that just in the sense that, like, abortion is a political issue, right? If you ask, like, your average American to name, like, a bunch of political issues, they will come up with that one, right? I don't mean it just in that way. I mean that your political commitments, which are often, but not exclusively, related to these questions of agency and autonomy and self-determination, they're like shot throughout the book. But it's done in this way that is never didactic, right? I mean, your protagonist is also like kind of, I don't want to say that she's a fuck up, but I think she would call herself a fuck up. I don't want to call her that, but I think
that's fair. Yeah,
I think that would be proper to like her own self-conception. And like this is something that we see in your writing on the war on terror too. And I just think it's such an incredible needle to thread. And I was hoping that you could talk to us about the process, like, as a novelist, how do you go about writing politically without writing didactically?
If you'll allow me, Hilary, just to say one thing directed to the audience before you answer the question, is that okay? Okay.
Hilary is nodding.
Okay. I just want to underscore what Abby said and communicate to you, Hilary. It really is a rare achievement, and you pull it off. Like, this is. I was trying to think about some way that I could pitch this delicately to people who might be, and specifically straight men, who might be hesitant to read a novel about abortion or a novel that is in interior narration of a woman protagonist, etc. But just like, so I can't do it delicately. But I'll say, like, if for some reason you're a straight person, a straight guy who's like, I don't want to read, I don't like female narrators, I have an issue with thinking about abortion, just read the fucking novel. It's an amazing novel. It's not a didactic, sort of simplistic slog. And here I'm thinking, well, I mean, part of me feels like thinking about like Uncle Tom's Cabin or something like that, which is effective as a novel and a polemical text, but it's, is terrible to read. It's an awfully boring book. But also more, I'm thinking about a lot of the shit that's happened in we three, and with Zach as well, have vibed talking about in the context of literature about the war on terror and post 9/11 literature, and people who may be old enough to have been reading novels about 9/11 or like the genre of a 9/11 novel may remember some of those texts. And I don't know, like, remember the fucking one with where John Updike was like,
oh yeah,
like the terrorist and the middle-aged Jewish guy are now driving. They're for some reason they're both in the box van that the guy's going to go blow up. It's just, and they have a Socratic dialogue about it. Just or Felix Beigbitter's little book Windows on the World, where basically the takeaway is, yeah, it was great because I did coke in the World Trade Center in the 1970s, and that was amazing. Like, just like all that, like, such shit, such poorly written shit. Whereas what you are doing is consistently deploying like a masterful style and a capacity for narration and psychological depth to just produce text with characters that are not, maybe I'll frame this in the way I did with what we talked about in the beginning, right? People who think they are going into this with predetermined generic or narrative expectations, well, they should buy the book anyways, but they'll
be thwarted.
They will be thwarted. Like, this is not about delivering what is already known or known. It is a meditation and a properly propulsive narrative in its own right. I just want to say that to the world, but to you specifically, then to underscore Abby's question too.
Thank you, guys. I mean, that's really, I'm very like moved by that compliment. And normally I would run away having received a moving compliment. But since we're on a podcast,
as a runner,
yeah, just be like, because I, just really respect you two as thinkers and readers. And so I'm moved if that's how you experienced the work. But I will try also to answer the question, because I do think, well, first of all, I agree. Like, straight men, you'll love it. Okay, and you don't have to learn anything you don't want to learn. I think that's always an option. But I have I have both some serious and not serious thoughts in response to that. I mean, one is, um, I find it, I find it pretty frustrating that, a lot of the fiction right now, particularly maybe in a little bit of the more mainstream publishing space is fairly apolitical or takes its politics for granted. And I don't, maybe I won't like dive into like name any examples or something just so as not to be too aggro or something. But I do think it's a bit of a quality that you notice, which is that like a shying away from the political, and even one that I don't think the writer is trying to do, or I think the writer would like to engage with that more, but maybe it's like also we don't like we that's something we're all part of. Like maybe like the limitations in that aren't about like one person or one writer, but are about like a lack of vocabulary or conversation, and also this idea that I don't know if you guys, I'm interested what you think, but it seems to some extent like people sort of assume that people reading literature like have the same politics or something, or that we're all in this liberal space.
Mhm.
When in fact there's so much to be contested in that space, and there's so much like hypocrisy and failure and way, which I think especially since the genocide started, it's so clear how much like liberal institutions are like the thing, what we think of as liberal thinking is part of that, like so I feel like all of those ideas or problems are also in there in that kind of literary space or something where people aren't really speaking their politics or contesting their politics or grappling with it. So I do think like, and the 9/11 novel is another like example of that for sure, where I mean, they're rough. They're really rough.
They've not aged
Uh,
well. No.
yeah. Yeah. But they do show you something. Like reading them is like a confession of like what the Americans think 9/11, or continue to think that 9/11 is or was, or it's like still happening. Or so, in
9/11
this
Groundhog Day.
yeah, no,
9/11.
I agree with your 9/11 groundhog. Like it is like that like false idea of like what 9/11, continues all the time and is happening, right now. Anyway, so I think that my the danger of writing politically, as you guys just said, is that didacticism, and is that sense that you would be like declaiming to someone, like first of all, that you would ruin the novel or you disrespect literary possibility, which is more open and indeterminate and about maybe like trying to create opportunities for new kinds of thinking or experience that aren't languaged yet, or that aren't like sort of hardened or reduced into formulaic language or that are possibilities that are like there for the next thing. They're like the word I was thinking of was ripe, which seems gross. Like I don't know why, but like but that is kind of what I mean. You know what I mean? Like they're not just giving you an affirmation, right? They're asking a question. They're involving you in a problem, in a conversation, in a community, in something toward the next thing. So I believe in that about literature. And so, a didacticism is failing on two counts. One, it's not doing that. So you're fucking up what literature can do. And also, you're probably like, you're not learning anything as a writer, and you're just like monologuing, like, which isn't good politics either. Like that's, so I think that is always the danger. I can't say whether it's harder to comment on one's own like successes or failures in a way those belong to like readers to decide, what's been useful to them or what was like alive to them about the books. But I think my approach to trying to do it is to really try to keep giving an account of yourself,
Mhm.
because that means it's maybe not like a guarantee against didacticism. It's not a guarantee that you won't miss something or you won't fail to account for something that might be quite important to one of your listeners or readers. But it's a way that you can keep sort of putting yourself on on the table, or like the stakes also include your idea of yourself and your idea of your experience, and also you've tried to account for the thing, like to be open and honest and have it be mutual and speak about things that are painful, including like reckonings that you have with your own thinking or your own background or identity, whatever that is, so I think like that question one, some frustration with both the lack of the political in contemporary American literature and with the superficial politics and politics that I don't agree with, but it's as though we already agreed about you know what I mean? They're treated as though we all agreed about them and we're all liberals and we all like vote Democrat or something, you know, like, I don't know if you guys agree with that. That's what it sort of feels like, is that we're all in the same space, or like, you're like, no, no, no. Like, no, we're not. And then I guess my approach to it is to try to finding ways to be vulnerable or feel like I'm having a conversation with myself, which seems like it hopefully makes it feel more open or makes it feel more like a conversation, or a sense that someone's not trying to lecture you, you know, if they're interrogating themselves as well. I don't know. So I think that's like the best that I've done in trying to think about it.
I'm wondering, just listening to you think this is off the cuff. So I'm thinking about this in terms of, I guess, a theme that we've already kind of alluded to, which is this question of like efficacy, about what makes an act of protest effective versus what makes a novel effective as a novel, and then what makes a novel about a political situation that is abhorrent effective as a novel that relates to the political. And it seems salient, one, that the question of the efficacy of protest, or the way in which like a protest becomes a type of text that people interpret in different ways, or that people presume is interpretable simply as like a communication to them, is a theme in this text. And there is this wonderful bit where again the narrator is speaking to a reporter who's like, I'm wondering if you thought what she did, and this is the doctor who's performing abortions illegally, was effective or the right choice under the circumstances. And her response is, well, the abortions she gave were all effective. Of course, but now you can't provide anything. Some people would say you acted recklessly, etc. Like, do you think getting arrested, getting media attention, having a big public trial was the point? Do you think publicity like this and protests like yours may be more effective right now than the limited care the clinic was able to offer under the new restrictions? And then the narrator, who's already sort of addled by virtue of the hunger, says, I hope I said, people don't do things because they're effective. Like, is having sex effective? It bothers me that if I bombed an abortion clinic, everyone would just get it. You could write it up without even talking to anyone. Like, that would make sense to everyone. Same as someone had walked in here and shot me in the face. That would make total sense. But if you try to do something else, anything else, everyone is like, whoa, you're crazy. Who signed off on this? And so you have that sort of like this thematization of, or a deliberate, explicit frustration of a type of epistemology of interpreting political protest as being like this, like a narrow communication. I think that probably applies to a lot of how people are processing protests right now, where it's like, well, this is, I have thoughts about the optics of people who are getting beaten to death by police officers. I'll do it differently, right? Which centers them. But then also there's this critique of like the utilitarian calculus of this. Well, do you think your protest was, you're doing a protest as opposed to just doing abortions elsewhere? Well, like that kind of like weird weighing of cause and effect. And that's in the novel, but it also seems like, and this is what I admire so much about your work, and forgive me if this is difficult to follow, I hope it's sort of coming together, like, is a question of like, well, what should a person expect from a good novel, and a good novel about political life and about political struggles and about political quandaries, and to be explicitly sort of psychoanalytic about it? Presumably one thing that should be delivered, even if it doesn't sound like a lot, but actually is a lot when you really think about it, is some degree of reflection, or some degree of capacity, like heightened capacity for reflection, or just abiding with distress and uncertainty. I mean, a novel that would simply be like, and again, I'm sorry to the Ghost of Harriet Beecher Stowe, like that was a very effective novel. So, sold more books, for more copies than the Bible, and, helped kick off a civil war. But like, it's not very effective as like a novelistic proposition, right? Or thinking about, I don't know, like the extremely cringe and overly unpleasant 9/11 texts, not thinking about them in particular, where it's like, damn, 9/11 was some real shit. Some clash of civilizations was going on there. Like again, like there's no transaction. It doesn't change where you are. I guess I'm trying to kind of align what you just said in terms of like a thing that you just described to us, this capacity of self-reflection or checking back in yourself, or trying to in your process, as finding some sort of mirroring in the type of reflective uncertainty, self-reflection of the reader, and as that like a test of efficacy. Like I don't know. I don't mean to say like ask you like, do you think your novel is effective? I think it is, but like, does that sort of vibe with what you're saying?
Yeah, I think like I love all this because it's it's at the perfect crossroads of the thoughts that are the hardest to think and to put into language, and then thoughts that are like great stoner thoughts. Like it's it's like both at once. Like which is
That's what we're going to title this episode.
yeah. I think like what is like so scary and powerful and correct about novels is you don't get to know. Like, you know, like, and that is the fact that you don't get to know is like is the thing that you have to know. And it means and keep being open to. So it's like Harriet Beecher Stowe, whether or not, well, I don't know anything about Harriet Beecher Stowe, but that won't stop me. It's like, you know, like any writing that novel at that moment, it's like everyone writing novels in that moment, it could have had some effect. You know what I mean? Like it's like you don't get to know when you're the one sitting at the desk trying to formulate these thoughts, you know, sending them out. Like she's in a certain kind of position where she can get a book published, you know, like she doesn't get to know that it will matter in this bigger way.
Yeah.
And in a way, I feel like the most, you know, I think your question was like, what is a novel good for? How would we measure the efficacy of a novel? And I feel like what a novel is good for, or how I think about it, is making more novels, which seems like a very limited outcome. But you're like, but it's the honest one. Like it's the most honest one is like that you could, maybe you could think well enough that someone else could think, and that they could be like free to make their art, and that they could experience that, you know, and it doesn't have to be a novel that they make. It could be something else, but it's something like that. It's an act of thinking and an act of not know, like a sort of like staying in a, what the space I hope to be in when writing, which is being open to like a more radical not knowing, where you don't really know what it is that you're making. You're trying to let it hold or contain or receive things you don't know yet, or the possibilities that readers will use it to know things, you know, like that they'll think with it. It'll be like a tool for their thinking. So you can try to make it the best possible tool for your thinking. And that's like, I think the best version you can do. And then you can hand it off and hope that someone else does something with it. And so I think like, that's how I tend to think about it. It feels I used to feel embarrassed by writing literature because it seems not terribly defensible. You know, like you're like, oh, there's so many other things. But whenever I think through it that way, I'm like, no, you're you're trying to create a thinking place and give it to people so that they can use it. And you don't know what they're going to use it for. And that's the really exciting part. So you have to keep it as open as you can. And none of us get to know who will be Harriet Beecher Stowe, you know, like 1,000 monkeys who are all Harriet Beecher Stowe, you know, or whatever. Like it's we don't know.
Thoughts with Hilary Plum.
Yeah.
No, I feel like that description, and I love it. And I do think writing fiction is defensible. And I think it could be defensible even if it weren't a tool for thinking. But I do feel like the way you're describing that is like almost uncannily similar to how I think about like a classroom.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like, you know, I've read the coverage of your book as it's been coming out, and for very obvious reasons, people are like, Hilary Plum's abortion novel, because like that's a hook that people can hang things on. But like abortion is not a thing that you're actually thinking about that intensely compared to a lot of other, like you're like,
That's correct. Yeah.
They were very effective abortions. They were done. Someone was not pregnant, right? There's like actually like a crystalline clarity to that in sharp contradistinction to so much else that's happening in State Champ. And I do think, like, if we're going to go with this frame of novel as, okay, I'm being like really reductive, but you know, one of the things they teach you when you learn how to teach is like, don't be afraid to be reductive. So sometimes we're going to go with that. Like, if this is a tool for thinking in that way of like helping other people figure out what their unknowns are, and even that there are unknown unknowns, right?
Jesus Christ.
Yes, I did that on purpose. Let's say one of the things that I think people are going to think about they're going to be prompted to not like this sounds like an assignment. And I don't mean it in that way, but like in terms of self-reflection, it's the hunger strike that I think, and for me as a reader, and I think for a lot of other readers, it is going to be a meditation on like food, the absence of food, nourishment, the absence of nourishment, hunger strike as protest, hunger strike in relation to eating disorder. Like those are going to be some of the things that are much more in these undecidable kinds of spaces. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. So the book, as you said, it's organized around a hunger strike. I don't think it is a spoiler to say that it is not. Angela is the name of the protagonist. It's not Angela's first hunger strike, in a manner of speaking. So she starts the novel underweight, and she's maybe in recovery, like again, left sort of undecidable. She's not in a great spot to start a hunger strike. That part is certainly clear. But so she's in perhaps some form of recovery from an eating disorder from the midst of her former athletic career as a runner. And so I wanted to ask you two questions here, which I think are related but still pretty distinct. I want to ask about the decision to juxtapose these two things, to treat the hunger strike and the eating disorder as, in certain ways, like one unthinkable without the other. And then the second, and this is a question that is very close to the heart of some of our concerns on this podcast, because we're always thinking about like psychic life. So I'm really interested in asking you about this particular depiction of Angela's interior life. How did you go about writing a character who is actively starving, like a character whose inner life and outer life are entirely structured by being like kind of out of her right mind from food deprivation?
Yeah, I agree with that kind of gloss of or I also think the novel isn't exactly about abortion. And I haven't, wanted to, it would be so annoying if I like disavowed that or something, but I do think that's not totally at the heart of what it's more about the things you just said. Yeah.
That's what I'm kind of saying.
Yeah.
Is like there's a clear political position and on abortion, and it's like it's not the abortion debate, right?
Yeah.
Abortion is framed as a positive political and individual good. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If there's something exciting about just being like, no, the abortion debate's over. The abortions are good. Now we have a bunch of other bodily problems. Anyway, no, I mean, that's not exactly what happens in the novel, but I do think it's more about those questions of bodily autonomy that you're raising and the hunger strike. I feel like hunger strikes, they have that relationship to abortion that they're about like a latency, like a latent potential, a kind of speech that is reserved in you or might be possible to use when you need it. And you don't know when you know what I mean? Like, so it has that sort of some echo or dark like overlap with fertility in a sense, right? It's a potential that is latent. And I benefited a lot from reading this book by Kevin Grant called Last Weapons. That was about like hunger strikes as an anti-colonial tactic, especially kind of in response to the British Empire and kind of spreading around different sites of resistance. I forget which years the book covered. I always forget an essential piece of information about this book whenever I try to recommend it, but I thought it was really very good, even though I'm bad at saying why. So I think, that question is, it's sort of like a wonderfully and difficultly like entangled one in thinking about like, the relationship of eating disorders to these things and why I wanted, for some reasons that we've already talked about, to have a protagonist, to have characters who didn't have to be good, and that wasn't what was asked of them. And that wasn't what they needed to perform in order to be heard and be considered like valid sources of their own speech. So that's one reason for Angela's like whole deal, like her personality. And also for the fact that the protest she chooses is caught up in something more negative or symptomatic, and the difficulty of distinguishing one's symptoms from oneself, like, or like the painfulness of that, of being like, this is something that's part of me that also is part of an ailment or a disorder, or is not something I would choose. So that kind of problem felt very real to me. I had a eating disorder in my teens, and I think what you describe is that sort of vagueness around recovery. And I'm sure people who are experts in this have spoken to it like better than I'm about to, but I think that that's like this difficult thing, and particularly in terms of like a more mainstream discourse around like addiction and recovery with eating disorders, because the substance of your addiction is something you just have to keep interacting with. Like you have to keep eating and not eating and being hungry and not, like that, just, you have to find just like a manageable, healthy relationship to that. But you don't have any purity. Like you can't just be like, oh,
Yeah,
I'm
there's
not
no
drinking anymore.
abstinence
Yeah.
yeah.
Like there's no abstinence, and you'll continue to interact with that same set of sensations and choice making that's like not unrelated to that choice making that was this incredibly intense and like life-threatening disease that you were I don't know why I'm laughing. They were having. So I think like when I look back at that time, it has a very distinct quality in like my memory of my own thinking, which is that it felt crazy. Like it's so like it becomes so consuming, and particularly as your weight gets lower and your body is really trying to ramp it up and get you to eat, you're like, that's all you're thinking about all the time. And so it's this very like dangerous other realm of thinking that feels like it's always like, I mean, available or something, or it's like there. So I was trying to interact with that, and maybe say something from that or about that, and to think about like illness or something. I have a neurological illness. It's like fine, it's fairly well managed at this point. Like I can live my life and do shit, but it means these like different like qualities of cognitive function, like times when I'm very sharp and times when I'm not. And so that too is like a way that you're like, I don't like I have an experience of myself that's like negative, like I can't get rid of it, but that's me. Or this like, for anyone, with neurological or psychiatric or all, like a moments when your brain is really not under your control, or it's not like doing what you would want it to do. You're like, that's still you. So I was trying to, at least for myself, think about that more. And that's related to letting Angela, not the protagonist, letting the writing in this novel not always be smart, and not always have to try to prove itself as this smart woman or this smart, because at least for me, that's caught up in a lot of those things, or those questions of being sick or well or functioning or not functioning, or being like the good brain or the bad brain, or like our part of that is that, are you smart, are you professional, are you good, are you, like, so I wanted to blur those lines a little bit, just maybe just for myself, with the idea that it might be useful for others. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think like also, the era in which I had an eating disorder was an era where there was like a bunch of theory around eating disorders as like political,
Yeah.
that I think has passed out of vogue a bit now.
It has.
Yeah, and they're seen more in like, psychiatric disorder terms, and the therapy is like a family-based therapy and stuff. You both may know more about this contemporary like treatment of eating disorders, but at that time there was more of a theorization of them as like a feminist thing, like essentially like a political desperation.
Yeah. I mean, Susan Bordeaux writes about this. I remember that. I have almost never gotten so much pushback from students as when I assigned work about like anorexia as some sort of like bodily protest.
Yeah.
It's the paradigm has really shifted.
I don't know how it's like that was so helpful for me to understand it that way, and it's weird to think that people in a similar disease state, like that we're just in a, you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
like for me, that was a really helpful like mode of thinking what was happening to me. And it really
Yeah.
like helped me get better. And so that doesn't mean it's right or like true for everyone, but I'm then have some natural sadness that it's not available to people now or something. But
Yeah.
it's also
No.
not for me to say what would be helpful for them. Like,
No, I get that. But there is this kind of language of like anorexia as cultural symptom that, and again, I'm thinking about this particular essay that compares hysteria and agoraphobia and anorexia in various eras as, as a cultural symptom and as emblematic of some form of protest that shows on women's bodies that can't be put into words. And, you can certainly see nobody wants to be called a symptom, right?
Mhm.
But on the other hand, when we're talking about suffering collectively is and understanding that your suffering is legibly connected to other people's suffering, that actually can, I think, be palliative in certain ways.
I wonder. So let me just stipulate. I don't think any of us, just to mirror what both of you were saying and to really underscore this for the audience, I don't think any of us are in any way trying to disavow or norm anyone's experience of what it takes for them to be safe or to be some kind of healthy or
No,
to
of course not.
understand their circumstances. And rather, what I think we're trying to highlight here, and it is, again, one of those things that is, yeah, like incredibly hard to put into language and also maybe half baked stoner thought, but like whatever, fuck it, I'll lean into it, is this way in which questions of knowledge, self knowledge, and control seem so tightly bound up in these experiences of both personal distress and understanding one's symptoms, but also reckoning with the way in which one's personal situation is symptomatic, perhaps in other terms, of processes and operations of power and social circumstances that involve other persons. And it seems to me that part of what is really important for people in different moments in history, and particularly now, I think, there's good historical epidemiology of mental health literature we can include in the notes on this, is the way in which symptoms become legible precisely insofar as that they are shared, like they exist in a kind of symptom pool. And there's a kind of recognition from both, you know, not just the people who are sort of experiencing this, but the institutions that kind of ratify those symptoms, whether it be in like a formally modern nosological text like the DSM or the PDM, or in the older languages like hysteria, but then also ways in which people can sort of see themselves and self-identify in those processes. And that there's for better and worse, this kind of process of self-recognition or recognizing something in yourself through these labels and categories that can produce insight and change, or at least give people something that they can imagine as opening up new futures for them, right? And what's so important about that, and I think we could say, just to speak specifically to what I think is on the table here vis-a-vis the eating disorders, sort of the history of that in the past couple of decades, is that we may be in one of those moments where, for a variety of reasons, the logics of identification, group identification, and sort of empowerment involve people feeling relatively liberated or more in control of their own circumstances, or in any event finding some type of recognition, self-recognition, affirmation, treatment, configuration through a more medicalized logic of seeing this more narrowly as in psychiatric terms rather than in its broader sort of sociological or social psychological dimensions, right? I think that may just be a moment that we're in sort of a pendulum type swing with this, as Abby's experience would suggest. And that's why there's this pushback, because, and this is, I think, that the key tie-in to abortion as well, is this thought of people feeling like, is the right umbrage people take at the suggestion that they are merely a symptom, or in other words, that someone else knows better than they know about themselves, or that someone else is knowing better, some discourse of knowledge, is going to trump, preclude, disavow, however you want to put it, their own sort of journey of recognition and finding themselves. And this seems so salient to the abortion.
That's what I was thinking. I was like, you're building to that, right?
Yeah.
And that's why, there's something that's so, I think, powerful about having abortion as the fixed point of the novel, right? It is the example par excellence of like the time that you do know yourself, even as the novel stipulates that we tend to not.
And all the discourse, and I think just to underscore that even further, right? So much of the way the sincere, cynical, runs the gamut anti-abortion discourse positions itself is about, well, we know better because, well, we know you're going to regret it. Or do you not know about the fetal heartbeat that we're going to force you to encounter, right? Even the narrator herself says at some point what people need to know is their options. But here it's like a type of foreclosure of those options.
And I just have to say there's this incredible line. I don't have this page. I'm going to read in a little bit a couple of passages, but there is one where you walk through something that I think for most people who get periods will know that 6 weeks isn't really 6 weeks. There might be, if you're lucky, 2 weeks of knowing, like if you're super, super regular, but really it's maybe 1 week. And there's this line in the book that's like, it's not even time to like decide whether or not to return a pantsuit and do it.
And I just, I'll just tie my bow on what I'm going to say here, right? Which is that scene also gutted me. Like I knew that, but this is where all my cards on the table, right? Being brought up in a Catholic context, but like being taught by moral philosophy and theology by like people who had doctorates and Jesuits who had doctorates who were incredibly astute in so many ways, and who had us, among other things, like debating like those like wild Hadley Archie's first thing style thought exercises where it's like, well, ethically speaking, if you woke up and your liver was stapled to the liver of another person, could you like separate your liver from this other? Like all this again, like like getting really down into like the scholastic kind of Aquinas style shit, right? It wasn't just the foreclosure of like, well, actually, this is how like this is what your cycle is. This is what a woman's cycle is like, right? Or like this is how pregnancy kind of actually happens. But it was also this kind of like production of like a spurious knowledge, which mystified what ultimately was the obvious stakes of the issue, which was that this shit's about control and about controlling women and forcing them to do certain things. And under the guise of caring for them, responsibilizing them, and making them face irrevocable and contiguous inequalities and the kinds of operations of oppressive power that are otherwise parts of their lives. It's all this one gestalt being put on them at the same time. And yet we had to somehow be taught to know better or to not take the people who knew in the firsthand way seriously. I'm sorry, I don't want to make this about me, but
I thought you were just demonstrating that this book is actually for straight men.
Yeah, it's very much for straight men. Like, honestly, it's the
which it is.
Bro, go buy it right now.
I love this resistant straight men listenership that you guys are.
I mean, they're out there. We love them. No, like literally, they're that's part of the symptom we love too. I'm part of it. But here's the point: that this entire education I received, there's so much of this discourse which is about knowing better and producing this type of like, well, like we have the very thoughtful position that it should be safe and legal but rare, right? This type of like weird, again, knowingness. That what that shit all does is that not just mystifies situations of power, right? But that it also, and this, I want to speak to something you specifically just said a few minutes ago, Hilary, namely, that for all reasonable and serious intents and purposes, the debate on abortion should be over or is over, and we all already kind of know morally what the stakes are. And yet, in this way that like the horrible repressed returns, it can get pulled back. It is being pulled back. It has been pulled back. And we all kind of also now have to know this too, even if some of us choose not to.
I want to ask a question about structure. Full disclosure, regular listeners of the show know that I teach gender studies. And so I've also, since Dobbs came down, I've spent a good bit of time doing programming on campus around reproductive rights and autonomy. And so one of the things I've done is like screened a lot of abortion related films, brought in speakers, et cetera. And so I have had the occasion to watch a lot of abortion movies. And I wanted to, and I think some of our listeners will know films like 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, the Romanian film. Or more recently, Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. And in films like this, and also I would say in other mainstream literary fiction depictions of abortion, there's this really clear narrative structure, which is like somebody is pregnant and they need not to be pregnant, right? This is the impetus that starts the novel or the film or whatever. And there's this clear narrative structure, which is like quest, right? Or journey. The protagonist leaves home. I mean, it's like the Odyssey, right? Except pregnancy.
Sorry, we're kind of
we're trying to go for the straight male audience here. It's like the Odyssey, except you're pregnant.
Or like we got grail pilled by a Jungian a while ago, so it's sort of like the grail that you got to get rid of.
Yes, it's like it's a grail, but you have to get rid of it. Okay, let me get this question out here. The protagonist leaves home and encounters like tons of obstacles along the way, eventually gets an abortion. Usually there is like a scrappy female friend who can advocate for them, who understands her plight and, helps along the way. And usually there's like lots of medical scenes, medical personnel. The actual abortion procedure is at the heart of it, right? It's really legible. And to be clear, I think there's like an enormous virtue to this, not just politically, but also in terms of making clear that these experiences and like their attendant settings, feelings, et cetera, are like proper subjects of like high art. Right. Like, so this is not to dismiss anything like that, but I want to point out how different State Champ is from this kind of structure. Right. It's a novel that's set in a clinic that's closed from the beginning. Right. I did not know until we just talked about it earlier today that the heartbeat laws where you were just imagining them having come down, which is, just horrifying that this was an active imagination and now it's something that could just have been 100% realist fiction. But the clinic here is closed. The doctor is in prison. Angela is not pregnant and maybe she can't even get pregnant. There's lots of fucking, like there is a lot of really unapologetic, not at all procreative sex in this book, and nobody has a pregnancy scare. And Angela is systematically depriving herself along the way of anything that could possibly nourish herself, let alone a fetus. So can you talk to us a little bit about your decision to structure State Champ in this way?
Yeah. I'm really thrilled by all of your questions, but I won't, just
Thank you. I
on
wrote
that.
them this time.
I love the idea of abortion being like the grail, but you don't want it. The grail, but you're trying to give it back.
Take my grail, please.
And so I appreciate all of those, those films, and especially them showing like an abortion as this desired thing, and showing these relationships between women. I think I was interested in writing this novel, and first of all, showing, like work relationships between, or sort of women's difficulty in having relationships with each other, which is weird because I do I feel like lucky and moved and like very supported in my life to have personal, professional relationships with, but I think it's hard, like the patriarchy makes it hard. And so one thing I wanted to show was just like some relationships at work that aren't like perfect. They aren't, you know what I mean? Like, I think that there's some real things that happen there, some of which I think Angela can't totally see, but she kind of glimpses. But so I wanted to show a different, like not the same supportive, like that kind of situation, but one that was a little bit more to me like the real world, where you are moving along with or through, or you're part of relationships that aren't able to do the things that even you want them to do, like maybe you're failing them as well. So that's one part of it. And also I just don't like a quest, uh,
You're not looking for a grail.
I just don't want a grail. I just, you know, I've never wanted one. And I think it's maybe in part, I'm a little bit more of an instinctive writer. I don't have do a lot of theorizing or have a plan or so, you know what I mean? Like I move a little bit more in a gut way or by exploring and then kind of figuring it out as I go. But sort of in my writing life, one set of thoughts that was sort of moving to encounter as I was sort of in the muddle of figuring out how to write about illness and particularly how to write about chronic illness, like an illness that doesn't get better or that maybe comes and recedes, is there, it's not there, but it structures your living, whether it's happening or not. Like it's your life, like it creates the structure of your life and your thinking to some extent. And we were talking a little bit about this earlier. So that really beautiful book, The Wounded Storyteller by Arthur Frank, which is sort of, like in the canon of kind of narrative medicine, medical humanities, like that was really helpful for its sort of like narrative theory of illness, how to tell illness, the kinds of structures people use to tell illness, and also like better ways to receive them, how to listen to people who are sick, particularly when they're in states where they're not being as legible or intelligible, like their speech is more chaotic, their storytelling is more chaotic because it's been undone, so that book was really good for thinking about, I think he calls it the remission society, or like what are the alternatives to this arc of like I was sick, I got better, which is a little bit more of a quest. And
Yeah.
of course the quest of anyone who's sick is to get better, like that's what we want, but it's not available quite a lot of the time. So then what? So I think that's one reason that I chose a structure that was really not that, and that wasn't about getting better, and that wasn't about attainment or achievement, because I think those are things that I'm not interested in. And structurally, I've spent a fair amount of time like seeking out like how to tell some other thing, right?
Mhm.
Where you don't get to have your grail. Instead, you have to keep figuring your life out. So that's why I chose that kind of structure. And I was thinking too about when you were asking that question or when we were talking before, like the ways that all of the political pressure is on abortion, is on that one procedure, that one form of healthcare, where it's like, it's so at the center. When really, if you're, you know, all of healthcare is so political. And particularly if you're like a woman or medicalized as a woman, or like in that situation, occupying maybe the many kinds of identities that aren't heard as clearly or well or received by kind of medical institutions or medical care, where you're like, oh, like all of those are really pretty political, where your account of yourself isn't believed, your pain isn't believed, it's not, your experience isn't seen as serious or real, and you have trouble believing, like it's like you yourself start to be like, is this real? Is this happening?
Mhm.
Did I make this up? Am I like responsible for, particularly if you're in that, whatever that space between neurological and the psychiatric is, where you're like being categorized one way or the other, and you're like, what does that mean? Like, am I in control of this in some way? Like what control is, to Patrick's thoughts earlier, when really a lot of that is being used to just obfuscate or say that it's a way that someone's just not believing you and not trying to care for you or treat you, whatever your problem may be. So I think maybe one reason to decenter that procedure a little bit was to like try to have some political thinking about how political all the other stuff is, like,
Yeah.
too. So it's not, all the pressure isn't on abortion. And I don't know if you guys have been following this pretty very horrifying story out of Georgia of Adriana Smith, who's brain dead.
Yeah.
If for listeners who haven't encountered this story, is brain dead, but is being kind of kept alive against the wishes of her family because she's pregnant. And it's like that story, I just keep thinking about, I'm not sure how this is related, but it feels related. It's like that story starts with her going to the ER because she's having these terrible headaches, and she's having like the worst headaches of her life. She goes to the ER and they send her home without any scans or tests. And she has blood clots in her brain, and she dies later that, I think it's within the same day or 2 days later, And so you're like, that's a moment where all of that is, you know what I mean? Like, that's like the key moment in her story also, and is a key moment about healthcare and the healthcare that she received as a Black woman, and the ways that her pain wasn't listened to and her account of herself wasn't heard. So I guess like somewhere in there is a thought about maybe trying to see like the politics in those other moments, and not only in a moment of this one procedure that people have strong feelings about.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I appreciate about the novel also is how it just like in a very mundane way makes clear that like, what we often call an abortion clinic is not just a place that provides abortions. Like it's a place that provides reproductive health care. And you also, and this is something I really wanted to make sure that we get to, and there's a passage I want to read, is the way that this book, I mean, it's an understatement to say that it doesn't sanitize anything. But one of the things that it doesn't sanitize is the history of gynecology. And there's a passage that I want to read. It's a long one, but bear with me. I think it's really important. Before I worked here, I didn't get how much of medicine is hands. You change a body with your hand. Even pills started like that, though I'd never pictured it. Plucking, boiling, crushing. Like you invent something, the speculum, say, we've got lots of them, that throws open all these doors. See inside, glimpse the slick arrangement of organs, which in this case have melted into and through each other. Fistula. Fistula means piss or shit leaks out the cunt. Infection, smell, mess, burning. A hell the baby leaves behind. All day, every day, you'd sit on a stool with a hole cut in it. You'd trickle, you'd smell, and you'd burn. Usually the baby has died. Dr. Sims, father of modern gynecology, had a little backyard hospital, if you could call it a hospital. His patients were all Black women who were slaves. They couldn't leave. You get fistulas from bad nutrition. If he could keep the women alive and locked up long enough, cheap enough, he could invent a surgery he could sell. Like if you are already so messed up you can't work, you can't have more babies for your owner to sell, then maybe your owner gives consent for some experiments, which the doctor says will be a treatment. After a couple of years, the doctor gets less popular. It's taking too long. The women are screaming too loud, and his assistants all quit. The women, enslaved, become his assistants, he says. They want the surgery, he says. For the operations, they hold each other still, according to him. The women don't leave any records. 3 names: Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, though there were more than 3. No anesthesia. It took years. Over 4 years, Anarcha had 30 surgeries, his records say. No anesthesia. That's the main thing I remember. Picture like the think therefore I am guy nailing a spring through the paw of a dog. I learned about it because animals have no souls, he said. Their screams were just mechanical, he said, reactions. Sims killed babies for real. Over and over, he tried to fix tetanus, he said. He believed the skulls of Black people grew too fast. He took an awl to the skulls of new babies. Tetanus kills, but he killed faster. Then one day he stitched shut a fistula. For the first time, the stitch held. Silver thread. The body healed. Anarcha healed. His records don't say if he ever cured Lucy or Betsy once he learned how. He didn't bother to record it or didn't bother to do it. No way to picture all that. You can't. When I try, I picture the women as us, all of us here, which is all wrong. When I picture it, I never picture Dr. M as the doctor. I picture her with the women as a woman, one of us. That's not what she'd choose, I think, for someone to imagine. But guess what? She doesn't get to choose. Close quote. Can we talk, Hilary, a little bit about this history and why it's so crucial to include it in conversations about reproductive justice?
Yeah, thank you for reading. It's always like moving and disorienting to hear when I'm writing in someone else's voice. It's sort of magical. But I think, I feel like that passage, whose facts I think are all true, including, I think, the Descartes about fucking, like that he thought dogs were screaming as a mechanical reaction. I think
there's a whole bit in Descartes and animals and like automata. It's wild. Yeah,
it's so. I feel like that, like the question that you framed and the problems that passage is trying to work, and maybe especially. When you were reading it, I was noting like that I kept inserting he said, because that's what we have is what he said, is his justification, is what remains and is the record. I feel like that's like, as far as I've gotten with the problem, which we're just in, which, which is like that we don't have access to a different healthcare that wasn't, invented that way. And even its terms or the way that we talk about it are caught up in that. And I don't know, like, I feel like I like reached the limit of my ability to think about it because it's so, it's so intimate and such a site of shame, everything to do with sex and reproduction and all of these things. And that it takes so long or so much work as a person to feel like that you can get to some place that feels like freer than that, or where maybe you're a little bit out from under that history. And so, yeah, I feel like that's the problem that I'm living in and we're all living in. But maybe also, like, it seemed important to put that in the book as like, this is where this health care comes from and where our conversations about it start, is about that control and exploitation, and racism, that's where this all begins. Like,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, for me, it feels like we've talked a little bit today about like right-wing rhetoric around abortion, and about, how sometimes it can be about regret, but like that's the kind, gentle rhetoric. The heavy artillery is, this is murder. This is immoral. You selfish women. You don't want to suffer or take responsibility, so you make something else suffer, right? And here I feel like what you're doing is, by refusing to cover up the history of the reproductive technology that I think all three of us have already said today, and that I will certainly say for myself, is an unalloyed good. You're thinking not about like women get off scot-free and babies suffer. You're saying like other people have suffered for you to have this freedom, so fucking use it. Like that to me is a very powerful kind of reorientation of this discourse that doesn't sanitize, right? At all. I mean, that was like, I mean, that doesn't make this like a very tidy march of progress.
To second what Abby is saying, part of what I also really appreciate about the way the book progresses and the way it circles around certain things and approaches them and then dials back and goes back into them, or have these things return, is that it speaks to these dynamics of knowledge that we were talking about, namely knowledge not just as this, what, like social progress, right? It's not this thing that's just given and then becomes unimpeachable, right? For all intents and purposes, the debate about abortion should be over because it's good. And yet it's proceeding regardless of that as a proposition, or rather the debate comes to stand, because clearly it's not even about a debate right now. Half the legislators that would be, sliding these things in at the end of closing sessions or after hours wouldn't be doing it if they were actually invested in any kind of actual debate. It's about power, right? But what I find so striking in the text is this attunement to, again, I think this has to do with the efficacy of the novel, this theme of like, not just entering into a position of heightened reflection, but that type of reflection or self-reflection or self-critical reflection involves this, well, I'll trope on what Abby just said about working against the pace of progress or the march of progress vis-a-vis running and the experience of running. One of the lines that the narrator offers is that you have to step back out of the zone. It's a rhythm, I guess, in it, then knowing about it. You have to forget, then remember. And elsewhere in the text where, even in just in these passing moments of sort of free association when, when she's thinking about the Michael Jackson stuff, right? About the Michael Jackson, like, this is amazing. The Michael Jackson thing, it's like everyone knew, but they pretended not to know. But then once they couldn't pretend anymore, they were shocked. But how could you be shocked? We all totally knew this. We totally know fucked up things like this happen. And we're probably right now happening. But it's like this every time, fake shock, right? This kind of inability to recognize what you know, or this inappropriate forgetting of what you should know or what you already know, and how that coexists with an awareness of scenes, of dynamics of power, right? Whether it's the the figure of Rose, who I won't spoil who Rose is or isn't or what they stand in for, but in the text, as you say, it's sort of everything that Rose knows is what we don't want to handle. But I'm getting there now, walking toward that porch. Or the transaction that happens between the narrator and the police officer, right? The thing is, it's the sort of thing I know about and the cop knows about, but who else would get it, right? We know that there are these scenes of trauma, of oppression, of horrible extraction and cruelty. And yet also so much of life involves not knowing about it or thinking that we don't know about it or thinking that it's actually a debate and not a given fact. And again, just to register this admiration for your text, it doesn't deploy in any type of simplistic narrative. And maybe this is, again, I don't want to, we'll bring back Harriet Beecher Stowe for the third time, but not necessarily in a bad way, right? I think in terms of the genre and in that era, a sort of Dickensian style didactic novel in which there's the good enough slave owner who's proved to not be good, then we go the whole typology going to the absolute worst, right? And there are there's a Christ-like Uncle Tom and various other figures, right? But there is this kind of like, we're going to give you all these different possible positions within the universe of the slavery debate, quote unquote. Right. And you could imagine, as Abby was saying, any of numerous texts which are like, well, here's someone who decides not to have the abortion, and here's someone who does. And like this sort of like, each character represents a side on the issue. And we come to know what they are going through in order to then make our own decisions about this. Like that very structure would be a type of mystification of the actual kinds of power that are happening in the world, because this is not simply an issue qua a propositional issue. It is a moral and ethical imperative and a political transaction that would be underserved, not just novelistically, but otherwise, if it were represented as something in those sort of didactic and false terms. And I guess if you allow me to read one more line, I find myself thinking about this bit where the narrator is addressing a man in their life sort of notionally and says, I could see that you didn't understand me, and more that it didn't matter. Whether you understood me or not didn't matter at all. This was beyond a question of one sentence or one conversation. It was something more beautiful, like I'd always had something of my own. Hey, who knew? My knowledge isn't waiting for you. It isn't waiting for anything. It's just mine. This is hard to put to words, but it seems like what you were accomplishing with this text is precisely what's so hard to do in the propositional debate mode or in the sort of any other sort of mode that I can think of, where it's like, here is a account of what this quote unquote issue means for people in their lives, where it does not reduce people in their lives to the issue, but instead presents the question of choice and like the limits of what can be known, not like just as a narrative conceit, but as like a demand for ethical recognition. Like we can't know what's going on with some of these people. We do know horrible things happen to people. And we should know better than to make choices for them.
Yeah, I love that. I think like that passage, that final paragraph you read to me is a really like important one for the book. And maybe I won't say too much more about why, but just like some of the things we talked about, that question of like allowing people to think their lives on their own terms, which means that they don't have to explain them to you and you don't have to understand them, and trying to find a way to render that, that's a knowing problem. But another one, when you mentioned the Michael Jackson passage, sort of relatedly is, what I got really obsessed with around the Me Too movement is how much its quote unquote revelations were just, what we call open secrets, like something everyone already knew, but which hadn't been like ratified, like it hadn't been like affirmed, like it hadn't been in the New York Times. So like that, like the beginning of the, downfall of Bill Cosby, although he's now back out and about, I think, but was like Hannibal Buress, like just saying during a show, like, go Google Bill Cosby plus rape allegation, or I forget what phrase he might have said, sexual assault, like, but he's like, literally was just like, go know what you already know. Like, go, he wasn't like giving them new info. He was just like, this is just a thing, like everybody knows. And that began, like that was him like bringing Bill Cosby down. But like literally all he was saying was like, go like admit what you know, or know what you know, or know what we all know. And that was this quality of me too that was so maddening, because you're like, all of these people have said this the whole time. They just weren't important. They weren't sites of authority or information, and we can like, that's like not so hard to like understand, but it is hard to like figure out in every moment when it's happening again, like, and where you are in it and who it is that you don't know that you're not listening to, because we rely on whole systems to make voices like audible or like intelligible to us. So that was like part of that problem that I'm putting, like that's in this novel, is those questions about like who gets to be seen as someone who knows something even about themselves. Like, so that's like one part of it. But running, like, I feel like it is related. I'm so glad you brought the running thing in, because running is like such a cool, like maddening sport, because you always know how good you are, because your times can just be compared to anybody. Like, you don't get to have any mythologizing about like, like if you were like in a different team, or like if you got to play with it, like it's just like, it's straight up like, how fast did you run this distance? You can compare yourself to the fastest person in the world, or to like your mom, or like whoever, or your rival from high school. Like, that's it. Like, it's so brutal in that way, but it means you like have to know, you just know how good you are. And there's not that many. I mean, I guess swimming or like other sports that are just like pure like time distance sports where there's no mediating factor like that. But that's one thing about running that I think is really epistemologically rich, I guess, which is like, it's hard. It's kind of a like radically humbling. Like, you have to do it. If you're going to keep doing it, you have to do it for whatever level is like achievable for you. It's not, there's not another story you can very easily tell about yourself. I mean, but we still are good at telling stories. So you could, like I go for little jogs now, but I still pretend I'm going to run some great half marathon or so, what I mean? Like, I can still be like, yeah, one of these days, like, I'll do that. So I think those are some of those, sites of thinking about knowing and not knowing in there, and about like how you might ever get to feel empowered or affirmed in your private knowledge, or free to know what you know in its own terms.
Hilary, the book is wonderful. I'm so glad we got to talk to you. This has been such a rich and like surprising conversation. Like, we went in so many directions that I didn't expect. I will, of course, put a link to the book and to your other books in the show notes. But if listeners want more Hilary Plum, including, say, on your own podcast or anywhere else, where can people find you?
Oh, yeah. So I have a podcast with Zach Peckham out of the CSU Poetry Center called Index for Continuance, where we talk about small press publishing, politics, and practice. It's a little more occasional. Sometimes we're doing it quite regularly, and other times there's gaps. But it's a great place to talk about culture making and small press stuff. So yeah, that's one place to find me. And then the books, but I feel like they're all internetable.
Amazing.
Delightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hilary.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. If you'd like to support the show, which is entirely made possible by the generous support of our Patreon community, and would also like to get 2 additional episodes per month, come find us over at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Hilary Plum. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.